No.
So you don't have to start reading through that. We will go through it in some detail. So I didn't go to the last service. I hope it was not super intense, because that's what this is going to be. The last time I did the 5-part series on Paul, I asked a number of people if there was anything that they would advise or anything they want, and half a dozen people told me they wanted Jesus and less Paul. More Jesus and less Paul. So that's what you guys are going to get, okay? This week we're going to be talking about Paul, and I'm not going to talk about Jesus overall. I'm like some comedians who retire their product as soon as they're done with it. When I do a class, I don't want to do it again. Maybe I should, but I did a 10-part series on the historical Jesus. That was probably 15 years ago, so I don't know how many of you were around for that, but I don't want to go through that again. But I do want to go into something. I've recently taken 4 different classes on the Gospel of Mark, and there's one part of it that interests me a great deal, and I'm going to be getting into that. Before I touch it, though, I just was interested if anybody's watched The Chosen. Raise your hand if you've seen it. Do you know what? Do you guys know what it is? It's a series. What do you think of it?
Entertaining.
Yeah, it is entertaining. I had a friend of mine ask me what I thought of it. I've watched through the 5th episode of the 3rd season. First of all, today's class will be a Jesus completely unlike this, because the Jesus there, I would say, is 50 to 60% historical fiction. Because you've got to make him look a certain way. You have no idea what they look like. You have to have lots of events and things. And then I would say 30 to 40% John. He talks about himself a great deal, sends his disciples out saying that they should talk about him. Whereas, like in the Gospel of Mark, he tells them to go out and tell people to repent and to prepare for the kingdom of God, not to learn about him. And then finally, I would say about 10% of the Synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and primarily Matthew. But you have to make choices on this. Like the Sermon on the Mount is on a mount in Matthew, but the same sermon's on a plain in Luke. So you have to choose which one you're going to do. So that's just the way it is when you're making choices. And so my evangelical friend who asked me to watch it, I said, I'm going to teach a class on Mark, and it's going to be completely different from Mark. And he took offense because he thought I was saying that The Chosen was no good. But I'm just saying there's one angle, one way of seeing who Jesus is. But we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Mark, and we're going to talk about one particular angle of Mark. But before we start, I just need to let you know some things. Can you hear me? You can shut the door. Yeah, shut the door if you want to. I don't know. Does everyone here understand that Mark was the first gospel written before Matthew and Luke, and written before John, long before John? And we know that Mark, the authors of Matthew and Luke, one other thing I enjoy about The Chosen is Matthew and John are running around with a piece of paper and with a pen, and they're jotting down everything that's going on. Whereas in Acts, we're told that John's illiterate, and no one knows who is the author of Matthew. So I mean, it's just like those sorts of things that you don't know what to make of it. It's but Matthew and Luke. Also, one other thing: 30 to 40% of the empire was made up of slaves, and there are very few slaves in that thing. And in writing gospels and stuff, it usually just wasn't one person. It was one person standing there and another person dictating. And you see this in Paul occasionally when he refers to somebody else. We used to call them slaves, we used to call them secretaries, and sometimes they're secretaries, but frequently they're illiterate slaves who are there. And when these gospels were composed, Matthew and Luke, they had Mark already before them, okay? And so they were actually agreeing with parts of it, disagreeing with parts of it. It appears they were satisfied with parts of it and not satisfied with parts of it. For instance, what's the very first story in the book of Mark? Does anyone know? The baptism, right. It's the baptism first. But Matthew and Luke thought we're going to take it back even further. And so they take it back to the birth narratives. So there's a difference in those three things. And so Mark created the narrative, the framework, and many of the stories. Not all of the stories, but many of the stories that were used in the other Gospels. And I'll show you how this worked. There's two ways to read the Gospels, and one's vertical. And that's what you do if you're in a Bible study for the most part. If you're in a Bible study, everybody reads the same passage. You read it up and down, and then you sit in a circle, and they say, what verse stood out to you, or what do you think? Okay? Horizontal is the Gospels. You're reading different Gospels at the same time and seeing how they tell a story, how they tell it similarly, and how they tell it differently. Oh, it still works. You need a book like this, Gospel Parallels, where you can look at these stories at the exact same time, okay? We're going to be doing a lot of horizontal reading today. I'm going to turn this on for now. So here's one story. It's the story of the rich young ruler. And you'll see how they tell the story. And I'll show you why I've highlighted these passages.
Gravity.
So the story says, and this is Mark's version, as he was setting out on a journey, a man ran up and knelt before him and asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. You know the commandments. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not defraud, honor your father and your mother." Okay, so Matthew has this in hand, and he's uncomfortable with parts of it, it appears. Okay, are there any parts of it that you're uncomfortable with in reading this? Anybody?
Yeah.
Say, go ahead.
Why do you call me good?
Right.
And the thing is, Jesus draws a comparison between himself and God. And if you're a Trinitarian, you sort of think that that shouldn't be there. And there's another issue with that as well. And then this is Matthew's version. Then someone came to him, that's the rich young ruler, and said, "Teacher," what word's missing there?
Good.
Good teacher. What good deed? He's moved good down the way and put it on deed. So now they're no longer talking about the status of Jesus, they're talking about the deeds. And he says, "What good deed must I do to have eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "Why do you ask me about what is good? And there's one who is good. If you wish to enter into life, keep the commandments." He said to him, that's the ruler said to him, "Which ones?" And Jesus said, "You shall not murder, shall not commit adultery, shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and mother, also you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Okay, so the other issue Matthew apparently had with it was that you shall not defraud is not one of the 10 Commandments. And he appears to be quoting the 10 Commandments here. And so when Matthew gets it, he says, I'll just clean it up a little bit because I assume Jesus got them right and Mark got them wrong. But that's the assumption. So, and you know, it's also made more complicated by the fact when you see people say they're going to put the 10 Commandments up in a particular place in schools, where's that, Oklahoma or whatever? There are 3 sets of 10 Commandments in the Bible, in Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5, Exodus 34, and they're not the same. And then when you look at the 10 Commandments in what Lutherans consider the 10 Commandments, they're different than the 10 Commandments I learned as a fundamentalist Christian. So when people say to put the 10 Commandments up, you can ask which ones you're going to put up. So, also, it's interesting, Luke also adds this sentence as well, but keeps the rest of it similar to the others. So they're each editing differently on what they do. So as a result of this, starting in the 1900s, biblical scholars started saying, okay, if Mark's the oldest gospel, is it the best gospel and the most historical gospel? And there's still a lot of people who still think that, and I'm not saying it's bad or whatever, but that was an assumption, and a lot of people thought that Mark was historical and Matthew and Luke put a bunch of theology on top of it, okay? And we'll talk about how it got to be that way. So let's talk about what we know about Mark. First, so what do we know? Who wrote the Gospel of Mark? For the most part, it's assumed it's anonymous. There are certain scholars, a guy named Richard Bauckham, who says it is Mark, but Mark's not identified as the author until the year 185 by a guy named Irenaeus, okay? So until that time, there are references to it and discussion about it, but it's often called, and people know who Mark is, that there's a Mark who's affiliated with Peter, but the weird thing is the gospel is really harsh on Peter. And so that's something you have to think about. It's written apparently between the year 70 and 75 Common Era. That's people use instead of AD these days. And that's near the time of the Jewish revolt. And when we talk about the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and when we talk about the New Testament, I tell you, there are two events, one for each. They're incredibly, incredibly important. For understanding the Old Testament and how it's put together, the Babylonian exile in 586, and if you don't know about it, you should learn about it before you start reading stuff. I was in the Bible club in which we discussed the book of Daniel, and that all turns on whether what your understanding is of the Babylonian exile, when the temple's torn down and all that. And in the New Testament, it's important to understand the Jerusalem revolt, where Jerusalem revolts against Rome, and hundreds of thousands of Jews are killed. Okay, and so this is written, it looks like, in the immediate aftermath of that event, okay? And it looks like it's probably intended for a community outside of Palestine, because Mark gets a few details wrong when he's talking about Galilee and Judea. And then finally, it looks like the author may be Gentile, which is very different from Matthew, clearly written by a Jewish person. And I say this might have been Gentile because there are a few times in which he interprets what Jewish people are doing to his audience, as if they don't understand what's happening. He says about washing hands, well, this is something that many Jews do, including the Pharisees. And Paul might have been an influence. And this is a recent idea. This is from the last 10 years or so, where people started noticing that the theology and the ideas of Mark match up pretty closely with Paul, and probably most closely in terms of its heavy criticism of Jesus' family and of the disciples. The book portrays both of them as being either crazy or stupid. And seriously, there's problems with them. And Paul, in Galatians 1 and 2, he's very critical of James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter, and John, whom he calls the three of them the so-called pillars of the church, and says that he got none of his gospel from them. He got it directly from Jesus, not from those guys. And he suggests that maybe the followers of James are telling the Christians that they need to be circumcised. And he says late in the book of Galatians that he hopes maybe they injure themselves while circumcising themselves. So that's Paul. Seriously, and it's fun to read how people interpret that phrase in your Bible. Say, whatever. It's just, so, but and Jesus is different in this gospel, and he's different in each of the gospels. Sometimes in major ways and sometimes in minor ways. But this is 4 ways that I think he appears differently as an individual than he is in some of the other gospels. 1, he's moody. Frequently he wants to be alone, and he's sometimes irritated with people. There's a passage in Mark 1. Here it is, Mark 1:40. A man with a skin disease came to him, begging him, and kneeling, he said to him, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Okay? And the different texts give one word here differently depending on the text. And it says, moved with pity, that's what mine says, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. Many of the Bibles and many of the transcripts, and some of the earliest transcripts says, moved with anger, he reached out and healed him. And many scholars think it makes more sense for anger to be there, because you would not replace the word compassion or pity with anger. But if the text said anger, you would probably want to change that, because you have a certain notion as to who Jesus is to begin with. So he's frequently moody, he's enigmatic or mysterious. He's clearly the Messiah or the Son of God, even though not everybody understands that or understands what it means. And then finally, he's secretive, which is what we're going to talk about today. Again, very different from the Jesus of the Chosen. The Jesus of the Chosen is your buddy and your friend, and this guy who says really compassionate stuff to people. The last one I watched was little James wants to be healed, and Jesus explains to him why he's not going to heal him. It's a great scene and everything, but it's completely made up. But it shows what sort of person he is in this case. And then when I say that Jesus is a secret Messiah in the Gospel of Mark, he's keeping his identity under wraps with 4 different groups. 1, he silences the demons. 2, he silences those who are healed. He heals them and then says, don't tell anybody about this. 3, and this is the oddest one, and probably something you've never heard before. He says he tells parables so that the people listening to them don't understand what he's talking about. So they don't understand what the kingdom of God is all about, which is the most difficult one, because there aren't many teachers who tell stories to confuse their listeners. They generally, no, seriously, you generally want to communicate, and one of the only ones who might fit in that category would be Socrates, who occasionally had that sort of approach. But that's and then finally, silencing the disciples. And so take the handout that I gave you, and let's run through some of these things. We'll start with, as I said, one of the most striking features of Mark is the use of secrecy. And I should tell you, I'm using this from 4 different people that I've used, and some of this material is stolen directly. In my day job, I can't do that. I'd get in lots of trouble if I just steal people's stuff and plagiarize all the time. But here, I can do it all the time. And so some of this material is from a guy named Mark Goodacre, and Mark Goodacre is one of the leading scholars of the New Testament. He has a few odd ideas, but I had him, James Tabor, I used stuff from him, and another scholar named Robin Faith Walsh, who teaches in Florida. And this is my edited version of Mark Goodacre's handout on this stuff, so just so you know. So the silences and demons, he starts off, what do you want to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? That's a demon speaking. You've come to destroy us. I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And Jesus' response is, be quiet, said Jesus sternly, come out of him. Okay? And it appears that the demon knows who he is, and as a result, Jesus says, keep that to yourself. And then that evening, after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let, and this is the narrator speaking. So remember, this isn't Jesus, this isn't the demons, but this is the narrator. But he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. So the narrator saying, these demons knew who he was, and he told them you can't speak. And he has some sort of control over them as well. And then whenever the evil spirits, the third one, whenever these evil spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, you are the Son of God. But he gave them strict orders not to tell who he was. Okay? Are you guys familiar with this? Have you noticed this thing before, the secrecy thing? Well, it becomes more bizarre when we move to those people who he's healed. And the first one's a case of leprosy. And Jesus then sends away the person by saying, see that you don't tell this to anyone. But then notice what happens. Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. And this is an interesting theme. When people are told what to do in the Gospels, in the Gospel of Mark, they frequently do just the opposite. Okay? And the most important one, and we'll touch on this again, is in Mark 16, the very last part of the story, when the 3 women go to the tomb. the guy with the white cloth on says, Jesus is not here, go and tell the disciples what's happened, and they don't, which is how it ends. It's a great ending to it, but it leaves things unresolved. But this is a case where they're told what to do and they don't. Here are cases when they're told to be silent and they continue to talk. And the next one is the story of Jairus' daughter. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. And you know, unfortunate thing about this story, and it's true of many stories in the Gospels, the only person named is Jairus. We don't know the daughter's name or the husband's name. But this story, and we'll deal with this a little bit interesting in just a few minutes on how Matthew alters the story. But here, there's a great big crowd, and Jesus, and there's a crowd inside, and Jesus kicks out most everybody, and Jairus' mother and father and 3 disciples are allowed to remain inside. He brings her back to life and then says, don't tell anybody. So I mean, actually, how are you going to keep that secret if you don't, if you leave the house at all? It's just a complicated, you know, it's just something you got to get your head around. Did Mark expect us to think that they never leave the house ever? Or they keep her under wraps, or I don't know how you do it, but that's what happens in this instance. And then in 7:36, Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking. So again, be quiet, and they keep talking. And then in Bethsaida, then his eyes were open, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home saying, don't go into the village. So he can't even go shopping or to the grocery store. He has to stay at his house. And then the last one is the most interesting to me. This is with Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus is calling on Jesus and saying, you're the Son of God, please heal me. And then Jesus doesn't tell them to be quiet. Jesus' followers do. They say, many rebuked him and told him to be quiet. And he shouted all the more, Son of God, have mercy on me. So that's not Jesus. Everybody else has gotten the message. And so they're spreading the message as well. Keep it quiet. And then we have that section that I told you that's interesting about the parables. When Jesus is talking in private to his disciples, he says, you need to know, I'm telling you secretly what's going on so you understand what's happening, but I'm speaking in parables to confuse everybody else, okay? When he was alone, there's a handout that if anyone around you could share, that would be great. So concealing the parables. When he was alone, the 12 and others were around him, asked him about his parables. 1, he told them, the secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, the disciples. But to those on the outside, everything is said in parables, so that, quote, they may be ever seen, but never perceiving, and ever hearing, but never understanding. Otherwise, they might turn and be forgiven. I have a friend who works for Wycliffe, and he translates the Bible for, particularly for one tribe on an island, it's Solomon Islands. About 300 people have no written language, so he had to create a written language and then translate the Bible. And I asked him how he dealt with this, because this passage is just very confusing. Jesus is saying, essentially, I don't talk in parables, I talk in riddles. Because a riddle is something that's confusing and sometimes you don't understand. And so, and it's different from what we were taught as kids about parables. Parables are, I was taught earthly stories with what?
Heavenly meaning.
And so these are earthly stories with who knows what sort of meaning. And the other confusing thing is when you read the parables of Mark, some of them aren't that confusing. You can figure them out, and people around him understand what's going on, and the Pharisees get upset once because they understand what he's saying. So what exactly is going on here? And this is Isaiah 6 that he's quoting, this very popular passage that he's quoting here. But, you know, that it's just an odd thing that he says. And I think Matthew just deletes this section entirely because he couldn't figure it out. And then on the next page is someone who sort of understands the secret, but not completely. And that's the story of in Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And some say, "You're Elijah," who's a figure from Malachi, who's supposed to be a predecessor for the Messiah. Some say you're John the Baptist. And then he says to them, "But what about you? Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ." You'd think people would want to know this, but Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. And then, as you might know, the story goes on that Jesus says, as Messiah, I need to suffer and die. And Peter says, heaven forbid. And Jesus ends up calling him Satan. So it's an interesting thing that's going on. Even his disciples who understand, and this is part of the secret, as you probably know. One is that Jesus is the Messiah. Two is that he's got to suffer. And the third part is that the kingdom of God is at hand and is going to happen at any time. But why doesn't he want people to know this? Okay? So in reading the stories, the question is, who is getting this and who is not? Before we get to why he might be doing this. Who does and doesn't get the secret? Okay? The townspeople don't get it. They repeatedly don't understand what's going on. Secondly, the Jewish leaders don't get it. And there are multiple times when they say, they don't understand, they become angry, or they begin plotting against him. 3, his own family. And this is another, if you're used to taking the Bible stories and mushing them all in together as one, it's interesting to read how Jesus' family is portrayed just in this gospel. There's no virgin birth, there's no song by Mary about various things. The first time we meet Mary is Mary and his brothers come and try to rescue him, because as the translation, some translations say, and they should say, because in chapter 3:21, it says because they thought he had gone crazy. So they don't understand what's going on with Jesus. Some translations stick in the sentence people, but there's no people in the line. It just says they came to take him away because they thought he had gone crazy. And then the people inside say, "Hey, your brothers and your mom are outside. Do you want to go see them?" And he says, "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?" But that's an interesting contrast, just in light of Christmas, where we talk about Mary, Virgin Mary, all that sort of stuff. In Mark, there's none of that, and she doesn't even understand that he's the Messiah. Okay? So these are the important things in this. People who don't understand. And then the disciples don't understand completely the other part. So who does get it? Any idea? Who does get it? The demons are one. We said the very first story is what? It's God. God says, "You are my son." In some translations, "Today I've begotten you," or "You're my beloved son, in whom I'm well pleased." Either one of those two. And at that time, he becomes the Son of God. He becomes the Son of God at different times in different Gospels. And here, it's at his baptism. He's declared, "You are my Son of God." You are the Messiah at this point. Obviously, Jesus understands what's going on, right? But he doesn't want to tell everybody. And then 3, the demons. You're right, the demons get it. And I told you on the very first page, when we were talking about the demons, someone who gets it is the narrator. The author of this gets it. He's saying these things are going on, and he's explaining why it's happening and so forth. And the assumption is you get it. They never explain in detail what the secret is, because they think you're on the inside and you understand what's going on. Okay? But now the next and the major question is, so why is Jesus so secretive about his messianic identity in Mark? Okay? You've been listening to this for a while. Do you have some guesses or some ideas as to what he's doing? Go ahead.
Well, 2 things. It could be reverse psychology.
Okay, he knows they're going to go and tell?
Yeah, he knows them.
Wouldn't it be simpler just to tell them, go and tell? Particularly if you think he's the Messiah. But go ahead. And what's the other one?
Let's see. Well, let's see, I just forgot.
Go ahead.
Well, in Matthew, which we're studying in the Wednesday Bible study, in one version it said he fled when John the Baptist was taken into custody. So
Okay.
maybe there's a sense that other places will say that he just left and went into Galilee.
Okay, that's fine for Matthew, we're talking about Mark.
Right, but it still portrays him as.
Mark and Matthew are telling two different stories. So don't bring Matthew in to understand Mark. I mean, you can from time to time, but the situation, you could say, yeah, I mean, I understand things were dangerous at that time, and not just for John the Baptist, there were other people who claimed to be messiahs. And in the year 70, at the Jewish revolt, there were 3 people inside who were claiming to be messiahs, and they end up burning down part of the place because they're fighting with each other over that sort of stuff. So it is dangerous with the Romans to be considered a messiah, because they heard Messiah, you said Messiah, and what do they hear? King of the Jews. And they hear someone challenging first Herod and then the emperor and all that stuff. So yeah, that's a good idea. Go ahead.
I think he wants to stay alive until the right time.
Okay, there's actually 2 parts to this question, and I'm gonna circle them, and you all emphasize the first part, and we'll talk about that. It could be that this is being told, oh, go ahead, did you have one?
I was gonna say, the witness was, you can't really know who Messiah is apart from looking at the cross, suffering.
I think you're getting ahead of things a little bit, which you always do. Which is great, that's why I love you. And I always bring you here to help me move things forward. But you know, it's interesting, and Mark, you can read it and come away with the understanding that many recent scholars do, that Jesus was a disciple of John. And when he's arrested, Jesus then steps forward. There's a really good book written late last year called Christ Maker. It's a story about who John the Baptist was. And I taught that last year, but I'll bring it up again, even though it's supposedly old. But there are two terms in here that you remembered yours?
Yeah, it's that the idea of Messiah was totally different for the people at that time.
Yeah, that's, again, you're getting ahead of things, which is great. There are 2 things here, though, to think about, okay? One is, Jesus was secretive about himself, okay, the Jesus part of the sentence here. And then the other one is that maybe Mark put it in there. Maybe this isn't originally what Jesus said, but this is an element that Mark inserted for different reasons. The authors of the Gospels told their own stories. And as I told you before, on the Sermon on the Mount, one puts on the mountain for a particular reason, because they're trying to make Jesus appear like Moses coming down from Mount Sinai. And Luke has the same thing on the plain. He tells the story on the plain because he wants to focus primarily on the message. The fact is, a plateau didn't really matter a whole lot to him. There was no significance to that. But it could be that Mark is inserting this in there. So there's 2 parts. It could be Jesus who's putting this in, and it could be Mark who's putting this in. And so we're going to look at both of these on the handout. The first one, the historical Jesus explanation, and you've mentioned some of these. One, Jesus was avoiding fame, spreading unduly. He especially didn't want with the healing miracles being crushed and everything. Actually, I think there's a thing in Jesus Christ Superstar where so many people are wanting to be healed that he gets squished and crushed by the people. And not that I depend on Jesus Christ Superstar to understand who Jesus was, but it's just that idea what came to them, and so they put it in here. 2, silencing the demons results from common exorcism practice. And this is true across many cultures, that when you exorcise a demon, you are in control and you tell them what to do and what not to do. And historical Jesus scholars have mentioned this as a possibility. 3, Jesus was taking care that his identity was not misunderstood. Okay, and this is partially what some of you said, and this is the most popular one you'll hear in sermons. They didn't want to be misunderstood, combined with number 2, that Jesus is the suffering servant, and he's attempting to correct or replace the notion that he was a military or political Messiah. Because if they thought he was a political or a military Messiah, they might start trying to round up and overthrow Rome and join with him in that. And he's going through the process of reinterpreting and re-explaining what the Messiah is. And it happens, this, if you believe this explanation, it's best argued in the story with Peter. Peter says, "You are the Christ," which means Messiah. And just so you know, Messiah doesn't necessarily mean supernatural person. It means you're going to lead the kingdom of God when it comes. And I think Mark starts getting a notion that it's somewhat supernatural, but as we saw earlier, he doesn't see it as on par with God. But Peter says, "You are the Messiah, you are Christ." And then Jesus says, "But I've got to suffer," saying, "I'm not like the Christ that you have in your head. I'm going to be a suffering person." And so he's reinterpreting, and Peter rejects it, says, "No way, that's not going to happen. Okay, that doesn't make any sense." And so that's what might be going on. And what I say is, combination of these factors have been held many times. Now, the second one is not something you hear in academia, but you don't hear very much in the church. And that is that this thing is used throughout the whole thing. Sometimes when it makes sense, and sometimes when it doesn't make sense. So what exactly is going on? And it comes up at all the key points. And one thing that's interesting to note is that on one occasion, this is how Matthew dealt with this theme when he was doing his story. And Mark, with Jairus' daughter, Jesus says, "Little girl, get up," and immediately the girl stood up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Now, as I told you, this is weird because there are hundreds of people outside the house at this point. So how are they supposed to keep this quiet? So Matthew just deletes it. He says, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." The interesting thing is, too, he's moved this laugh line. A laugh line happens in the other story, outside, where there are lots of people. This laugh line happens when there are 3 disciples and the mother and father in the house. They laughed at him, but when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl got up, and the report of this spread throughout all of the district. So rather than to deal with the secrecy thing and the difficulties stuff, Matthew just says, "Forget it, let's just move forward." But Luke keeps it. And you see, he left out the eating part too, because he didn't really care. But Luke keeps them both in. So, I mean, they're different in how they're handling these things. Luke finds it somewhat interesting, apparently, and keeps it in there. And so, as I said, there's times that the narrator is telling this too, not just Jesus, but some of the others. So, the fact that other writers of the Gospels are changing this, it sort of invites us to say, why is this here? Okay? And now we're going to get to a guy, a very controversial guy, but he wrote one of the pioneering books of biblical criticism, even though it was more than 100 years ago. His name's William Breda. That's how you, actually you're German, you can tell me. Is it Breda? Is that right? Yeah, Breda. I read Reed for like a long time until I realized someone told me it's Breda, so it's Breda. So he comes along in 1901. Not many people have written about this, and he becomes incredibly interested in this. He only lives to the age of 47. An amazing thing you'll see here, he wrote this book, I give the German title, in 1901, not translated into English until 1971. Some American scholars read it in the German, but most didn't deal with it until the 70s and 80s, and dealt with it front on. Now it's talked about all the time. And the class I took by William Goodacre said it's one of the 10 most pioneering books on the New Testament. So let's look at what he ends up saying down here on number 3, his big idea. So he reads these stories about secrecy, and he said they make no sense to me. They don't in general make any sense. So he assumed Mark was putting them in there. And he focused particularly on the text in 9:9, which I haven't discussed so far. And that's the transfiguration. And in that case, Jesus has 3 disciples see him transfigured. And then Jesus comes down and says to them, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So it's weird, instead of proclaiming it now, they're supposed to hold this as information for who knows how long. But that's the idea. And so he came up with this idea, and this is, I mean, you got to follow along with me to understand what he's saying. He thought during Jesus' life, no one understood him to be the Messiah, and he didn't talk about himself as Messiah. But then when he dies and is resurrected, all of his followers said, he's the Messiah. clearly, and then they read that back into the beginning. But then they said, well, why didn't anyone know if Jesus knew he was the Messiah back then? And so the authors contended he came up with this secrecy thing. He told everybody to keep it quiet. Okay? So I've done the math equation for you in bold. Non-messianic traditions about Jesus. So he has these stories, great stories, healing, all that, but non-messianic, plus the conviction that Jesus was the Messiah, and then finally, and you add in the secrecy motif, and that's how you come up with the Gospel of Mark. Okay? So essentially, you read back into the story what happens at the end. And you sound like, okay, this might be made up, but there is two sections of the Bible in which it looks like Jesus is declared the Son of God at his resurrection. And you can look these up later if you want, but Romans 1:3, Paul says, and it's at the top of your third page, he says, Jesus was declared with power to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead. So Rada was saying these people had Paul's theology, but they were dealing with this issue about when he became Messiah, and that no one, it seems impossible that people didn't know that back then, so we've got to deal with it somehow. So that's his idea about this thing. But there are strengths and weaknesses to this argument, okay? And no one today takes the thing whole cloth. But it's interesting what he was doing. Some of the things that were wrong with it. This is one, that his secrecy motif doesn't carry on throughout the gospel, okay? In Mark 5, as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with Jesus. But Jesus refused and said to him, go home to your people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you. So Brady doesn't deal with that very well. I just read his book over the last 2 weeks, and don't buy it. Trust me with it. The translation's not great, the grammar's terrible, and when the translator doesn't understand English, they just use the German term. And then there's also a working understanding that you know Greek. So if you know all those things, that's great. And he apparently doesn't understand capitalization in English either. But the thing that is that scholars today say that are important is don't just look at Jesus' words, but look at his actions. And he was doing stuff that seemed to indicate that he understood he was the Messiah. Okay, from going in on the donkey on Palm Sunday, that's a very unusual thing for most people to do, and it led the people around him to say, the Messiah. Cleansing the temple, something that he did that would seem to indicate that he thought he had some sort of authority that's going on. And then people around him thought he was acting like he was the king of the Jews. And as you hear, note Jesus' crucifixion as a rebel or insurrectionist. And most of your translations are terrible, and there are songs about it, and there's even a band name called the Thieves on the Cross. The term in Mark is insurrectionist or rebel. These are people that led groups that tried to overthrow Rome. And so that's what Jesus is saying in this passage in 14:48. Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a rebel? Okay, or an insurrectionist? And with him they crucified two rebels, one on his right and one on his left. Okay, it's in Luke that this gets shifted down to thieves because it's a very embarrassing thing to have, the Messiah killed on the cross, okay? But he did get some things right. And this last category is my stuff that I put in here. You might not agree, but I think it's a good thing that he pointed out that basically we're not dealing with transcripts of his life. These things are, this notion of a biography in ancient times is very different from our understanding of biography. Frequently, they're called bios, or bioi in the plural. They're usually trying to tell you what is special about that person's life and how it's consistent throughout their lives. And so they're not trying to go through and say who they slept with and all of the bad things that you expect in a biography today, or even an autobiography. So they're telling a story, they're telling their own sort of story, and it's closer to a sermon, what's going on in these biographies. They're trying to convince you of what that Jesus is the Christ. And this is how Mark is doing it, through the secrecy theme and then his crucifixion and stuff. These are, and I refer to the term as a theological construct. A couple of professors call them propaganda. Propaganda is such a terrible word. I just think of it as advocacy. They're saying, this is who he is. And Matthew, it's saying, he's the new Moses. That's who you need to understand who he is. And he's the Messiah, okay? And as I point out down at the bottom, it's also, you have to understand that this isn't just an earthly story. With the demons involved, it shows that this is a cosmic drama. That Jesus has been given the Spirit of God, and he's doing battle with these other people who are spirits as well, with his demon possessions and stuff. So, well, let's flip to the 4th page. And I told you before, some people got it, some people didn't. Some characters get it, but some don't. Peter confesses Jesus is Messiah, but fails to grasp that the Son of Man must suffer. So he gets halfway there. But one person who gets it completely is the woman who anoints Jesus for his burial in Mark 14:3-9. And she's commended for it. Truly, I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Which, of course, Mark then omits her name. So we can tell the story, but we can't identify who she was. And she understands that he's the Messiah and that he's going to be crucified. So that's understood there. And then also, there's the issue at the cross. And it's a contrast between the disciples and the 3 women who show up. There are women, Mary, and Salome, at the cross, the burial, and the tomb, who have followed Jesus from Galilee and ministered to him. In contrast, the male disciples denied him, Peter, betrayed him, Judas, and fled, everybody. So that's the contrast that you're supposed to get. But you're still left with this difficult thing that I told you in Mark 16. And it's something that Matthew and Luke and many people have had a hard time with, because it just ends with the person in a robe, and Matthew becomes an angel, tells the 3 women, he's not here, go tell the disciples in Galilee. And then it says they didn't do it, okay? People translating and copying the book of Mark added sections to make it more comfortable for them. So if you have your Bible, and next time you look at Mark 16:8, and there'll be an addition that says 9-20, and then it'll say this is not in most manuscripts or early manuscripts, because it's a difficult ending to the story. And each of the other authors, Matthew, Luke, and John, changed that thing so it's not so difficult. Look at the 3 passages I gave to you. Luke 24, it says, not just that the disciples fled, but they remembered his words, that he had to be crucified and died on the 3 days. So no one had to tell them. They already knew this. So that helps clean up the difficult ending that you get in Mark. And John 2:22, after he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this. So in those other ones, things weren't secret to them. They already understood it. So they're dealing with the difficulty in Mark as to what's going on. And then finally, his disciples did not understand these things at first, but when he was glorified, then they remembered these things. And that's actually what Vreda is saying. They didn't understand at first. No one understood it at first. But then when he was crucified and resurrected, they did understand it, and then they all understood what happened before then based on that. Okay? So this is a little bit difficult. Does everyone understand exactly what's going on here? Okay, so here are my takeaways, and we can get back to it when we do this. The advantage, I think, about learning stuff like this that people know, academics know, but you don't, which is frequently what I've said over the last 30 years. I want to tell you things that are being discussed by people who read these things every day, but they don't tell you in the congregation. And I'm not saying about our pastors, but I'm just saying, oh good, he's just now coming in. But I want you to know some things actually when you're reading things. When you're reading Matthew, it's interesting to see how Matthew has edited and expanded or deleted stuff from Mark. These are my takeaways. Gospels, including Mark, are not mere transcripts of Jesus' life and ministry. And I think this is what Vreda is teaching us. These are sermons. These are, they're trying to convince you of something with their story. And so sometimes they, focus on certain things and not on other things, okay? That's his important contribution, no matter whether you buy his thesis or not. Each of the Gospels written by a real person with a point of view. And sometimes, as I told you, by 2 or 3 people. You would often have, and there's a great book on the role of slaves in writing, transmitting, and copying the books of the New Testament. What is her name? Actually, it's something I'm interested in, so we'll probably do it on the issue of slavery in the Bible in an upcoming class. But that's an important thing to remember. These things aren't just handed down by God and everything in it's the exact same as the others. You can actually see the changes that are being made in the text. 3, the 4 Gospels present very different pictures of Jesus. And I was taught when I was a kid that, and my kids were taught here in confirmation that the differences in the gospel were the same thing as 4 people witnessing a car wreck and giving it from their perspective. But I think it's actually more than that. I think each of them have a different experience in understanding who Jesus is, and they're telling it in different ways. And it's important to know those things and to know the differences in what they're saying. As I said, Matthew's Jesus is very different from the Jesus of the chosen. In no time in the Synoptic Gospels, and that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, does he say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. That's only what you'll find in John. Ancient biographies are different from the modern ones, as I mentioned before. 2, learn to read the Gospels both vertically and horizontally. It's great to be in a Bible study and read these things vertically, but get a book that's a Gospel parallel and look at them and see what's going on. There's an interesting one in Matthew 8, 1 through 4.
I think I marked it.
It's the healing of the leper. Matthew likes to add crowds to every scene. So Jesus doesn't do much of anything in private. So he takes the story in Mark of the leper. And it doesn't say that. In Mark, it's a leper came to Jesus begging him and kneeling. He said, if you choose, you can make me clean. Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I do choose, be made clean. And then he tells him not to tell anybody else about it. And the confusing thing is, Matthew's taken that story and then added, when Jesus had come down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. And then he goes and heals the guy and tells him not to tell anybody in front of the great crowd. So sometimes, you have, those are like little slip-ups when you're doing it, but that's his important thing, is to say Jesus was really important in his day, so he's adding that kind of detail. And the authors of Matthew and Luke freely edited and expanded Mark's account. And then finally, be skeptical of those who present a unified image of Jesus without acknowledging that they're editing, adding, and changing stuff. So when you see someone say, as some scholars do, this is what Jesus was like historically, realize they actually had to take certain details from certain Gospels and elevate them, and they had to lower them. And that's part of the reason that we have so many different versions of who Jesus is. If you go through historical Jesus scholars, you'll have some who say he's like an ancient cynic, that he's an apocalyptic prophet, that he's any number of different things. Did he foresee the end of time? Some people say yes, some people say no. Did he think that he was the Messiah? Some scholars say yes, some say no. And that's because they're elevating some things and lowering other things. And the story of Chosen is a case where certain things are elevated, particularly the Gospel of John, and other things are reduced. Okay? That's it for the class. I hope you enjoyed the ride. I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you, but it's just I wanted you to be aware. And the next class I'm going to do is on the book of Luke, and the book of Luke and Jesus in Luke, and how the book of Luke is Jesus in the book of Luke is more Jewish than he is in any of the other 3 Gospels. Yet the Gospel is also one of the most anti-Semitic Gospels we have, and is used to justify pogroms and the Kristallnacht. And so we're going to talk about, did the author realize what he was doing, or did Jesus understand what he was doing in terms of combining his highly sharp criticism of Jews at the same time that he's presented as a new Moses? Okay? Any questions? You gotta have questions. I just told you something you've never heard before. Go ahead.
Is the Chosen based on the novel by Han Potok?
And no, Han Potok story is about two Jewish kids, one who's Hasidic and one who's Reformed, and that they become friends despite the differences of the families on the state of Israel, Zionism. I don't think Jesus is mentioned in there unless someone says Jesus. Yes, I don't think he's mentioned on. Go ahead.
I'm grappling with something you said along the lines of, it wasn't until after Jesus was crucified and rose that the disciples said, hey, he really was the Messiah. So what were they believing all the time that they were following him? I thought that, yes, indeed, he was the Messiah, was an affirmation of
that's
what they had believed.
that's what Mark wants you, I mean, that's, according to Vrede, that's what Mark wants you to think. But there were many so-called miracle workers at that time, and other people who led groups. I said cynics. There were cynics, C-Y-N-I-C, who did things and had followers. So they could have easily thought they weren't in Jerusalem, and they were outside of where a lot of this stuff was going on. So there could have been, he was also clearly healing people. But I think when you talk about his actions versus his words, sometimes his actions lead you to think he understood that he was the Messiah, and that's the problem with Vrede. He picked 12 disciples. Why did he pick 12 disciples? Have you ever wondered this?
12 tribes.
For the 12 tribes, and when the kingdom of God comes, each one will represent or judge a tribe. Okay, that's something a Messiah does, not a regular guy, or even a miracle worker of some sort. But there were other important people who. People follow other people for any number of reasons, and many of these people, as we hear in Acts, that John and Peter are illiterate. This isn't like a book club. I think they think that something special is going on, and they might not understand the whole thing. And the number of people who claim to be a Messiah goes up and down after the collapse in the Jewish revolt. In the 130s, another guy comes up and says, I am the Messiah, and the leading Jewish people say he is. And all the people get together, and then they get destroyed. It's called the Bar Kokhba revolt. And so this idea of being Messiah was around, but there were other groups of people who were leading individuals and so forth. So, who had the hand up over here? Oh, go ahead.
I'm wondering about the two endings of the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah, short and the long.
The
I
short-
talked about the long, which was 9 through 20.
That's the one we read, but the short is in the earlier unschuls or manuscripts,
Right.
where it ends with us hearing the story. And are we gonna move on and tell it? So you've got a thief who gets it.
So that is.
You got a soldier who says truly that's the Son of God, but it's left down in
To
Mark.
us,
with our-
which is the way many people have interpreted it. First again, in Mark, it's not a thief, it's a rebel or insurrectionist. And the idea is maybe the author wanted to conclude by saying, the disciples were never told, but you have, and it's incumbent upon you to now tell everybody that the Messiah has come and he's been resurrected. And this secret, you are the one who needs to let it out. As I told you, who gets this? The fifth person I said who gets it is you. You're told in the first the first 8 verses of Mark 1, he's the Christ, the Messiah. That's what I'm going to write about. Here he is. Don't make any mistakes. All these other people don't understand it, but you do. And then it comes back around in 16 with him saying the disciples never realized that, but you do. But it doesn't say that. But that's a very popular interpretation of it.
Do you buy into it?
I'm going to be like the end of Mark and just not answer. Leave it for you to say. But I think it's provocative. It's changed. I grew up in a fundamentalist family, and you couldn't read these texts as being different from one another. And we did. In about the year 150, there was a guy named Tatian who takes all 4 Gospels, combines them into one. It's called the Diatessaron. And he did what I told you before. He excluded some stuff and included some stuff. And I'm fascinated. I think the fact that we have 4 Gospels that don't all match up with one another, the church fathers knew that. They knew that, and sometimes we're more uncomfortable with it than they were. Just like in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, there's 2 creation stories in there, and they don't match. But the people who put Genesis together, they were comfortable with that. And I think we need to realize that and think about that when we're interpreting. It's also true, as we understand it, that Matthew and Luke read Mark and thought that it wasn't, that it had some issues. In fact, Luke talks about that and says, I've looked through all the manuscripts and so forth, and now I've come up with my own version, here it is. So I think the fact that they edited it, when we're thinking about our understanding of who Jesus is, we need to remember these things and incorporate them into our understanding of who Jesus was.
Growing up in the Missouri Synod,
Yeah.
I was taught that every single word was inspired by God, and that creates an issue.
I know, that's what, as I tell people, I've led a life in spiritual detox. But take the story that I just gave you at the very beginning, where the originating ruler says, good teacher, I mean, they obviously changed it to teacher, what good deed. They've taken good and moved it because, for a particular reason. So if you believe what you believe, you have to explain that to me. And that becomes difficult. Or Matthew adds the crowds in the story that I just read to you from Mark 8. You have to explain why that was added to the story that's in Mark. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but I think when you're putting these things together, you have to discuss what's probable, because we can come up with possibilities for any number of things. But when you talk about what's probable and why they did those things, I think that's what we're dealing with. And I think it's okay. I didn't use this as a takeaway. I think it's okay to grapple with these things. And I think the Jewish community is much better than we are at grappling with issues like this. You know, even from a young age, they play a game at many Reformed churches called Stump the Rabbi. And you get together as a 12-year-old and you ask questions of the rabbi until he can't answer it. And, you know, maybe next time you can do that with the pastor and see when he can't answer. But I think it's okay. We're not going to solve everything ourselves in our particular time. We're going to see things that others didn't see. And I think with Vreda, he was interested in exploring that, and it's good to see that each gospel has a theology behind it, and that we're not dealing with secretarial transcriptions of what went on.
Rabbi Bice, could you leave us?
I'm not.
Could you leave us with your 4 principles that I think are so good?
These
Of the Bible, you mean? Of
No,
reading the Bible?
you teach it in confirmation.
Oh, I do. I mean, the main one that applies to this is read your Bible. You're going to be surprised by what's in it, because that's the big thing. People don't read their Bibles, and this friend of mine who got really angry when I was saying that The Chosen and Mark told very different stories. He was like, The Chosen's great. It's helped me understand this stuff. And I said, when's the last time you read Mark? That's what I'm interested in. And he said, maybe like 30 years ago. And so that's the thing is, when you read these stories, each time I read a story, there are things that just surprise me. I mean, any number of stories, sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. But your image of Jesus, Jesus is just not the friendly guy in the Gospel of Mark that you find at suburban churches. And so, he was grappling with, and I think you're trying to deal with how dark and how difficult he was doing in the Gospel of Mark. Because, when he says, let this cup pass over me, he's really having a hard time. And we need to understand it wasn't all just fun and games. It was a seriously important thing, because he understood, according to the Gospel, what he was facing. That's a tough thing. And what's he say on the cross? He only says one thing on the cross. And he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, we have a service in which we take all 7 phrases, crush them together as one, and you forget what this Jesus that's in Mark that is struggling with what has happened and feels abandoned at his death. I mean, that's an image of Jesus that we have in our tradition. So, any other questions? Anyone need to get to church, probably. So, okay.
Thank you.